So, intro. That's kind of weird. Coders, you have been anonymously selected to join our little heist. We are prepared to make a withdrawal. We from Mr. Bradley's account. The only problem is we don't know how much we can take. So, apparently, we don't want the withdrawal flag. So, if they want to know how much they can withdraw from Mr. Bracken's account, this is where you hack into the bank and send us Bracken's account balance. This may help you get started. We'll be watching. Okay, so we have a secure login page, and Anonymous gave us some text. It doesn't quite make any sense. And we need to somehow, from this bank, get Mr. Baratheon's account balance. How on earth are we going to approach this? I can just try just saying admin. That might work. Nah, it's a good try. I don't know. So let's go ahead and look back at this text that Anonymous gave us and see what we can do with it. Well, I remember it, so I'll just go ahead and write it up. So Anonymous gave us a single quote, space, or space, 1 equals 1, space, dash, dash. Congrats, hacker, you extracted this data, or data. And here we have an array of something, tuples. And we've got an index, what looks like a username, a password, and we have Joffrey, I think. I didn't actually watch Game of Thrones, but I'm assuming a few of you did. I think this is Mr. Baratheon. So let's go ahead and go back and see what we can do with this user information that we somehow acquired with this funny piece of text. Joffrey has a super secure password. Not helping him today. And wouldn't you know, we got into the bank. We now have Joffrey's account balance. Apparently nothing comparatively in checking, but a lot in savings. So Anonymous would be very interested in that piece of information. We've got a little over $3 million. So let's go back and let them know what we found. Not a lot of fanfare. The Westeros Anonymous faction thanks you for your service. Okay, so now for the real intro. What are we learning about today? A little bit outside of the workbook, we're going to talk about SQL injection. That's very relevant to the other stuff we'll be doing. Then after that, we'll talk about validation, followed by a short blurb on enums. So SQL injection. SQL injection is a type of attack where hackers attempt to manipulate an application's behavior by injecting SQL. So this is just an example, one of many, where an attacker will send in various inputs hoping to manipulate the application so they can cause it some sort of behavior that they can exploit. So a rhetorical question, we just injected SQL into that application and we were able to retrieve information from the database. Imagine what you might be able to do if you injected maybe some Java code. There's probably some extra steps to that. It needs to be compiled down to something like bytecode or whatnot. Or on a JavaScript application, injecting JavaScript. Random fact, previous company I worked at, I made my password a line of JavaScript code because I was learning JavaScript, and it caused it to crash. So apparently, there was an issue there. So we're going to take a quick look behind the scenes as to why our hack for Anonymous worked out. This comment here, don't panic. This is written in Python. I mentioned last week that because we kind of are learning fundamentals, seeing a totally brand new language is a little less foreign than you might think. So it's definitely going to be different syntax, and it's not going to be familiar, but I think we'll be able to understand it to a certain I forgot to turn on comments. Sorry. I was so excited about that intro. There we go. Okay, so here we have a block of the Python code that we exploited. Let's take a minute to look at it. We have at the top, we have something app.root / method equals post. Then we've got this def thing, who knows what that is. Something called login, and then a bunch of code. Can someone guess what type of code this might be? Based off of MVC, what we've learned. You want to take a guess as to what we're looking at? A controller, yeah, that's right. We're looking at a controller. So this is controlling inputs at an HTTP endpoint. And so in here, the comments are going to help us out quite a bit. We get the username and password from the login form. So the username gets stored in a variable, password gets stored in a variable. And then there's a query to the database. We will be talking about SQL next class, but this right here is a line of SQL. And so we query results from the database. And so what this is basically saying is, if the username plus the password exists in the database, we're going to store that in this variable. And so the coders, the brilliant coders that wrote this, said if this person exists in the database, we're going to let them log in, basically. And then finally, if they don't exist in the database, if the username and password doesn't exist in the database, we're just going to send them back to the login form and tell them login failed. So at the surface level, this seems reasonable. Right? Does the username and password exist? Yes. Continue. No. Don't continue. So where things go wrong is with the SQL. So as a hacker, we're trying to send inputs into the application and exploit and manipulate the application somehow. The inputs that we, the hacker, have access to is the username and password. That's sort of our gate to sort of throw stuff at the application. And so this SQL command here is written using the plain text username, and the plain text password is used to construct the SQL statement. So the SQL that Anonymous gave us was this string here, the single quote or 1 = 1 --. And so what happened was when we passed that in, the SQL statement inside the code ended up looking like this, where username equals empty quotes or 1 = 1 --, and password equals empty. So to break this down, once again, we'll be talking more about SQL. You don't need to worry too much about the SQL portion of this. But the first part of the SQL statement says select all from users. So it's going to select all of the users, but only select users where the username equals nothing or 1 = 1. So the OR statement is always going to be true. And so it's always going to select all of the users from the database. This -- here comments out the rest of the SQL. So all it's basically going to do is just say select all the users from the database, because we added this always true statement and then commented out the rest of the SQL. So all of that, no pressure on like fully comprehending like how all the SQL works and stuff. We'll have plenty of practice on that later. But I wanted to kind of give like an inside view as to why this is a problem, how we exploited it, and why the rest of this lecture matters. So in summary about the whole SQL injection thing, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for a hacker. We don't know how the inside of their application is written for a hacker. And so if we're passing in data, we don't know that that's going to work. We might have to try different exploits. We might have to try something that's not SQL. Keep saying we, that's probably the wrong term. We're defending against this, but we have to understand what we're, as developers, securing against. So, but the general pattern is that there's an access point, and so that could be an HTML form. It could be the ability to upload an image. That's an access point. An HTTP request. If you remember when we talked about APIs earlier, where we're requesting data from the API, we're sending data to the API, different things like that, or even an application dependency I don't know if I told the story yet, or not about colors.js, but essentially that was an example of someone taking something that we used to build an application and then using that to exploit it. So SQL is just a really good example of how this works, how this whole hacking thing works. Find an opening, send stuff in there, and see what happens. And so that leads into validation. So with validation, we have validation on two sides. We have the client side and then we have the server side. Client and server are two terms we haven't used much during this course. We've talked in terms of MVC. And so to sort of connect these two pieces, the client is basically synonymous with what we consider the view. So like the HTML, the viewable part, this part that the user is interacting with, is the client. The server is what we've been thinking about as like the controller and the model, stuff working in the background. And so maybe another example of this would be, imagine an app like LinkedIn. LinkedIn has a website, they have an iPhone app, and they have an Android app. If you make a post on LinkedIn, like where does that data live? Does it live on the iPhone app? It doesn't. It can't just live on the iPhone app because it needs to be accessible by the website and the Android app. Like all these different clients, all these different views need access to the same data. So in something as big as LinkedIn, where we have all of these different clients, all these different views, they'll point to, in many cases, the same controller and model, the same server. And so when we think of client and server, that's sort of the two things we're thinking of, the view and then the controller and the model. So why did I bring that up? When it comes to input validation, there are two major choices as to where to do it. We can do it on the client and or we can do it on the server, and there's a very different use case for those two different things. So we've already seen a bit of client-side validation. You can go very deep down this topic and get quite a bit more advanced with JavaScript and stuff. But a simple example is when we take an input and we say the type equals email. And what we see is as the user or us, the developer, tries to type in an email, and if we forget the @ symbol, it's going to say, oops, you're missing characters. This is not a valid email. And so the browser is basically stopping us from inputting an invalid email. So that is client-side validation, validation happening on the view. This is useful for improving the user's experience. This is useful for maybe alerting the user that, hey, you're putting in something that's not an email, so they don't accidentally submit a typo that they might have otherwise avoided. But it does not make the application more secure. So when we're talking about validation, improving security, this is not what we're talking about. It's just making the user's life easier. So client-side validation is still vulnerable. What if the form didn't let us submit SQL? So in this previous example, when we had the whole bank thing pulled up there, let's say the form was written in a way where it's like, hey, that looks like SQL. No, thank you. Or even if it didn't allow certain characters, like if it didn't allow quotes or equal signs, it might have been a lot harder to submit that type of SQL. If the form was written that way, we could easily bypass it using something called curl. And I don't think we've had exposure to curl, but curl is essentially making web requests, HTTP requests, essentially from like a terminal or from JavaScript, something that's not a browser. And as an example, I have a curl request right here, just to show, not really teaching curl, just showing an example of it. So if I paste this curl in here and remove all the weird stuff that happened when I copied it, I think that's good. Nope. It's a control error. There we go. All right, one more try. I had this working at some point that I don't know quite what I have that is not valid with it. Oh, I'm missing curl. Yeah, someone was about to say that. Almost. Anyways, I don't want to fight with this too long, but essentially what this will give back is this will basically just give back a bunch of HTML, and inside there you can find the username and passwords. Maybe to give another example of curl, if I just were to say something like curl google.com, it gives me back the HTML for google.com. If I was to curl an API, it gives me back some JSON data. So the point of this isn't to learn curl. The point of this is just to say, hey, we can get around client-side validation just through the terminal. And so when we think about client-side validation, we're just thinking about making our users' life easier, helping them not make a mistake that they didn't want to make. Model validation is a lot more secure. It provides security. And so to have better control over the data hitting our servers, hitting our data, typically what we're trying to secure as an application is whatever's in the database. That's usually what we're trying to secure. And so if we want to secure that, we want to protect, most importantly, the server, which is the controller plus model. And so if we add validation on the model, it can be useful for a lot of things, but it's also very useful for security, and that's kind of the angle I'm promoting. Random piece of trivia, Android apps are written in Java, making it one of the most widely used languages for mobile development. All right, sorry, that was random. All right, cool. So validation syntax. So this is what we're learning about, validation in Java. Validation in Java starts with the model. If we don't write validation in the model, like these little at things, it's not going to be very useful to us, at least in the context of what we're working on right here. So we can add constraints to our fields. We can add multiple constraints. Here we have like at email over email, and so this is going to provide validation for this class's input fields. Additionally, we can even add validation error messages. And so we can add a message to the validation saying something like username needs to be something like this, or this is an invalid email, etc. So at one level, sorry, we're talking about now. We just looked at the model. Now we're going to think about the controller, and so we can use the at model attribute to link it to our. Oh, I'm sorry, my brain got confuzzled. So what we've done in the past is we've used the at model attribute to basically link inputs from a controller to a model. So for example, if we had a class that had the field username and password, and we had a form that submitted username and password, we could use at model attribute to create a new user or to link it to a user when we submit it to the form. So this is something we've seen before right here. And to a certain degree, it provides validation because it's not going to allow us to submit values that aren't part of the form or the right type. However, with what we're learning today, we can take it a step further with the at valid. So we're going to combine at valid with at model attribute. And this will cause the controller to throw an error if it's provided data that doesn't match the validation. So if we provide something that's just a bunch of numbers to an email field, the controller will throw an error and crash the application. We probably don't want that. And so the final piece to the controller portion of this is that we need the error object. And so at valid throws errors, causes errors if there's a validation issue, and then at errors catches it. So if you remember like a try catch block, this kind of functions like that. So you can think of at valid as the try statement that may throw the error, and then the error object is what catches it. So here it's just a code snippet. We see the at model attribute that we're already sort of used to using. We add on the at valid portion of it. And so this will cause um, the method to throw an error if to throw an exception if it gets bad input. However, we can catch it with the errors object. And so here is just an example where we say, if there are errors, if there are validation errors, we can do stuff. We can do whatever we want. Just write a custom block of code right here. And then finally, we have the view portion of this, time leaf. So time leaf has special impact syntax that allows us to link a form input to a field in our model and leverage the model's validation that we wrote. So here we see an example where we have th field equals user.email. And so this is just linking this input field to the class's email field. And then right here, we have just a place to display the errors if there's any validation errors. Now it's important to note that this does not depend on the controller's configuration. So this thing right here, if it that has errors, we don't need to write custom code here to make this work. So we'll talk about putting it all together. I realize actually I'm really fast. I got to be too excited about that hacker thing. I haven't stopped for questions. So I'm gonna take a breather, and we're gonna go for questions. Anything that we covered about SQL injection, about the validation in view controller of the model, anything so far? Something like that. Yes. Right. So the question was essentially, how does @valid know if the object's valid? Like that's the I guess the first part of the question. Um, right. So it knows it's valid based off of how the model is written. I don't know if this is directly answered or not. But we'll get there. So if the model does not have any like validation written into it, like we see, like, yeah, like on this slide. So we have like this line right here is a validation line. This @ symbol right here is part of validation. If we removed these, all of those from our class, @valid would have nothing to compare against. Correct. Right. Hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, the controller depends on the model. Yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so @valid is connected to @size in that email, and it like would check it if you put @valid.
Right. So yes. So hypothetically, let's say someone submitted a username that was 100 characters long. Um, then it would throw the validation error to the controller. Yeah. Or if it was a misformatted email. But if we removed these two lines and someone tried to submit a username that's 100 characters long, it would be okay with it. Yeah, exactly. Cool. Thank you for those two questions. Other questions? Yes.
So with a TH field, is that just for validation purposes versus using something like name to pass data into the
Let's see. I believe you're referring to here, the th field. Yeah, I believe that is specifically linking it to the model as opposed to if we were to do something like th name. I believe we would need to pass in the model. Hold on, talking about myself here. I'm sorry. Can you rephrase your question? Or
Oh, so like I was wondering if TH field was just primarily for validation versus passing data in to be stored or active.
Um, so that's actually one thing I haven't tried out. I haven't tried out seeing if Um,
Because the way it looks, the way it
mhm.
almost implies it could be used that way.
Yeah, that's so to the level that I understand it, I've only seen it used for the purposes of validation. I'm not sure if you could take it further than that. That's where my own brain's like starting to have questions too. Yeah, maybe we'll have a chance to try that out. See, that'd be cool too, though. Cool. Other questions? Questions on hacking? None of those. That's cool. All right. So putting it all together, kind of came up in sort of the discussion a minute ago, but having these validation pieces above our fields, our model, that is required for any of the syntax in the controller or any of the syntax in the view. It's required for those to make sense. It's required for those to really do anything meaningful. We need to start with validation in our model, and then we can kind of do stuff with it. So we can link our time leaf model and leverage the model's validation inside of our view with the th field to link it to the field, and then the errors to link it to the validation errors. With our controller, we can use the @valid to link it to the validation um, built into the model. And then @errors will catch those errors, store them in an object, including the messages. Um, yeah. So let's go ahead and pull up Visual Studio, IntelliJ, and that's the right button. There we go. And go ahead and just add validation to our doggo app. So as a 11, as a reminder, this was the app that we had as an example in a previous class where we can chat with the dog. Hello. And if we want to, we click on the dog and the cats take over. Right. So in here we have a profile section, and it hasn't been styled yet. Maybe we'll fix that with time leaf here. But with this form, there's 3 different fields, and this would be a really good use case for validation. So the right place, if we're trying to make a solution for validation, the right place to start is going to be with the model itself. That's where all of the validation seems to stem from. So for starters, for the username, it seems like it'd be a good idea to put some parameters on the size of it. So we'll say min equals 3 characters. That seems like a reasonable lower end. Then max, I'm going to say 30. Then for the email, we have an @email annotation. And then for the bio, I think we'll just do size, and min will be 0 because it's okay if they don't have a bio. And then max will be 4,400. I don't really know how many words that averages out to, but that seems large enough. And finally, we can add some messages. Let's say message. Is that? Yeah. Okay, and then for the email, we can just keep it simple. We'll say invalid email. Then for the size, message equals, say user three and 30 characters long. Cool. Be consistent. All right, so we have validation. We just put it over our private fields here. And so it's not going to really do anything. It's not going to change how the application works. We could, as an example, mess with the validation. So we could just say, I'm going to do a username that is 1 character long. And I won't try to go over the limit for the bio. That was unexpected. I thought that would let me do it. Let me see here. Double check that. Let me double check my controller. I have the @valid annotation on my controller, which would explain why, I believe it would explain why I have the error. Can never be too confident. All right, so let's switch this down to just 1 character for our test to see if we're able to bypass the validation. And we are. And we can even see that it stores it properly. So if I say hello, my username displayed here is just 1 character long. And so even though we have the size validation over our username, it's not really, it doesn't matter. It's like, it doesn't care, it seems like, at this point, because we're just using, we're not using the validation on our controller or in our view. So with our controller, we already saw that if I had @valid on there, it's going to crash. Try to demo that real quick here. I'm just added @valid to our post controller. And so I'll say 2 characters, gives us an error. This is not what we want to happen. We don't want our application to crash. So if we're going to throw an exception, if we're going to throw an error, we need to catch it. And the method to catch it here isn't so much a try catch as it is including the errors object. Now, when I was playing around with this, I kept on trying to make it the error object without the S. I don't know why my brain wanted to do that, but it caused me problems. So, all right, now we have the errors object. And even though we don't have any other code except for this errors object, it's going to catch the error. So our application is no longer going to crash. And so if I go back to the profile page and I try to make my username 1 character long, it bypasses the validation, and I'm just able to go ahead and change it. And so even though there was a validation error, and the application knows there's now a validation error, we have an errors object that is holding that error. And it's not complaining, it's not doing anything. And so in the workbook, we saw, oops, didn't want to do that. In the workbook, we saw an example where we could create an if statement. So we could say something like if errors dot has errors, and then we can do different behavior. So if we say like, if there are errors, we're just going to return the profile page. And then if there are not errors, we will update the user and then redirect. So this is one solution for our controller. Make sure I refresh. Go to profile, do a 2 character username. This should throw a validation error. Yep, and I can't submit the form, or it appears I can't because it keeps just sending me back to the form by returning profile here if there are errors. And so all that is happening so far is we have a validation line on our model that says we have to be at least 3 characters long for a username. We tell the controller that we actually care about those validation errors with this @valid annotation. So this is bringing the controller into the game. And so it does not crash our application. We catch those errors inside this errors object. And then to make use of the errors, we then have some special syntax in our controller that says, hey, if there are errors, we're going to do some special other things. Right, so that is the model controller. The next thing we'll look at is the time leaf portion of it. But I'm going to pause here for questions. Any questions? Yes. Right. So I don't have anything to display those messages. I don't have anything wired up in Timeleaf yet for those messages. And so there are two different ways that we could display validation messages. One way is we could probably find a way to pull it out of this errors object and feed it into the Timeleaf form. The other way is we can link the Timeleaf form to the model. And that would be the next thing I think that we'll end up looking at. And so I think linking the Timeleaf form to the model makes more sense for this, but technically I think you could do it both ways. Or we could do something like our own custom error message, like the form is invalid or something like that, and just force feed it into the form. But it'd be better if we linked them together. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yes. Um, so you're asking about if you needed to validate multiple parameters. Now, just to clarify, are you asking about having multiple validation things in the model, like adding at? Oh, okay. So this is using model binding. And so this is binding the inputs to a model. I haven't really experimented with using multiple models inside the controller. Yeah, possibly. Um, yeah, I had a conversation earlier about the order of these, and we kind of experimented with it a bit. And what we found in that conversation was that Java wants this errors object after this object. I'll say, gut feeling is that Java is not going to like using multiple model bindings per request. It's my gut feeling. Maybe you can do it. Maybe it's possible, but it's also probably not a good design pattern as well. So I'm going to say I don't know technically the answer, but this is probably not something that you'd run up against. Yeah, great question though. Thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, right. So that was one thing I didn't do. I elected not to do is um, to essentially force feed data into timely view. So I could, for example, it's probably worth doing now. I could, for example, include model in my parameters and then say something like model dot add attribute errors, then say in Midwestern fashion, oh, there be errors, semicolon, Java cares. And then in our user, not that, in our profile, I could have something below the form, say, th if it's text equals $ errors. I think that's right. So now we will try this again. We'll submit it. And then I get a custom error message. And I use the model to pass it in. Yeah. Great question. Thanks for that. Cool. I think I'll leave that code in there. I think that we can have it. We'll have a special message for if there are errors at all. We'll just have that at the bottom, and then we'll link the timely form to the model. Which we'll be doing next. Before we progress, though, any other questions? None. Okay. Cool. All right. So, admittedly, this is the syntax I'm least familiar with, but I think we'll be all right. In the profile, yeah, I knew I wasn't going to be familiar with them, so I have a reference here. So we have at field to link the input to the field. Th field equals user, which is the instance of the class, dot username. And then additionally, we're going to want something to display the errors. And so I'm going to add, give us more room, a moment. I'm going to add a paragraph element here. And I'm going to say th, I think it's errors, yeah, equals, and then it's going to be the same field. I can't forget the $sign. Did that last time. So I'm just going to copy this text. Cool. So we'll just test it for the username field for now. Let's rerun this. Well, it kind of just showed it for us because I resubmitted the form by refreshing it. But I'll just go ahead and do it again here. A single character submit. It does break the formatting because I need to come up with a better solution. Let me do that real quick because I care more than I should. Span, there we go. Refresh. I mean, it still won't look great, but it'll be something. Sorry. Refresh. Okay. Yeah, so it just adds there without breaking the line. So anyways, so we do get our error message here, the one that is we specifically wrote inside of our model. And so the next experiment I want to try, because we kind of have this working full circle, is I want to strip out everything inside of Doggo. So we're going to get rid of the Doggo controller. I'm going to get rid of this. We don't need the model anymore. At this point, we still have @valid in there. We're going to give it a test. Let's reload this. We'll try a single character username. And, oh, because we have @valid in there, of course it's going to throw an error. I'm going to try just removing everything. I want to verify if it's going to allow us to use the time leaf validation without the controller being involved. Yeah. It didn't stop us. Let's see here. Yeah, all right, it's working. So it looks like we will need the @valid as part of the controller as well as the errors object. And that is to trigger the response from the model. Let's try this again. Profile, single character, submit. I feel like there's something I'm missing here. Yeah, that might have something to do with it. It could be that I really do need this if statement right here, because if I don't include this if statement, I am saving the model bound parameters into the user object. I'm overriding the user object. So I think is what's happening is I'm still overriding this regardless of what else happens. So if I catch it with this if statement in my controller, I can stop it from overriding the user. So in this case, all three elements are in play. So let's go ahead and refresh it, see that it works as expected. We'll review why everything works together. Right, so now it's going to catch it. It's not going to redirect, and that's not going to overwrite the username. Okay, so kind of bounced around there for a little bit. We'll do a quick recap after questions. So any questions on what we just did? Yes. Well, so if hypothetically I didn't have an if statement and I just had this, add models as well. Model, not models. Are you saying to do something like this? We can test this out. Then we'll discuss it real quick. Refresh. So the reason why adding there be error statement to our model, the reason why it's still redirected is because there's nothing stopping this return statement right here. So this is our controller. It handles the post request when we hit submit on the form. It runs this block of code. And the code is going to reach line 51 and line 52 if we don't stop it. And that's what this if statement is useful for, is stopping it. Because we have a return statement that just exits the controller. And so once even if there are validation errors, it's still going to redirect as we've kind of experimented it and demoed. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm not saying this is best for by any means, but
Mhm.
I'm just curious, is errors, would that be null if there are no errors? And if that is true, could you just put like if errors and leave it at that if it was truthy versus it being falsy?
That's a good question. I believe errors is it's like an entire object. And so if we were to say like if object, the object won't be null because the object
Okay.
exists. We can definitely test it out because I could be wrong. It does not like this. Yeah, it doesn't like it. That's I got. All right, cool. Other questions, comments? All right. So as a recap, the most important thing to make any of this work, we need to start with our model. We need to get our validation in our model. And this is what our controller and our timeleaf view are going to reference. In our controller, in order to make use of the timeleaf validation, we need the @valid annotation thing here after model attribute. So it'd be a model attribute @valid. This whole string is one thing, comma, and then we will also need this errors thing. If we don't have the errors thing, our application is going to crash, and we're not going to be able to do much with that. Model is optional. This is just so we can feed data into our timeleaf template. In this code example, I need this if statement because if I don't have this if statement, I am going to redirect to the home page and I'm going to overwrite the user. And so here it's useful to check if there are errors in the validation so I can choose a different behavior for my controller. And then finally, in our timeleaf view, we are displaying the errors conditionally using this @errors, the th errors annotation right here. Yeah. And the full role of what th field is doing, to say I don't have a great description for it right now. I need to double read up on that one. But I'll follow up with that all on Studio Review for that. It overrides this right here. Oh, sweet. Yeah, that's right. Because if you have data in there and you reload it, it's referencing the model. Sweet, thank you. It's great. Cool. So that really brings us up to the end of lecture. We have a bit of extra time, but I think I'm going to give that back to y'all so you have plenty of time for studio. Talked about a lot. We really talked a lot about SQL injection. Actually, I take that back. Sorry for the jumping around. We do want to do a very, very quick overview. I promise it'll be quick, of enums. Oh, this is an important question. So let's say you're working on a project and you want to use validation in it. Unfortunately, these validation tools that we're using are not part of the standard Java library that we get by default. So if we wanted to add the validation tools we just have been discussing to an existing project, how could we do it? Question for anyone? It's okay if you don't know. If you just have a guess, I'll take it. Yes. Yes, so we need to update Gradle. Gradle is managing our dependencies, and this validation thing is a dependency. And I'll give a very quick view. In our build.gradle, I have here dependencies related to validation, and those need to be a part of it, and they can be included through the project by reloading the Gradle stuff and it installs it, etc. So generally speaking, don't need to go too far down that road, but generally speaking, that is where we would update our dependencies. So enums, literally the only slide I have on this, somewhat intentionally. So enums represent a fixed set of values, or kind of like a collection of constants. Enums, kind of demonstrated by the workbook, pair very well with like a form dropdown. Now, these are useful to be aware of, and if you want to use them, you definitely should use them. However, I generally, like, enums are extremely similar to a class, like a generic normal class. And so with enums, you can have methods, you can have getters and setters, you can have all of these different things. You can make the, and so generally speaking, the way I like to think about enums is enums are to a regular class as to what like a switch statement is to a chain of if-else statements. It is just a different approach and maybe a cleaner way of writing something. And so, yeah, I just wanted to sort of bring up enums, kind of give you my take on it. And if you see them out in the wild, just know they're out there. All right, cool. So, final random piece of trivia, and then we'll go for studio. After the movie The Interview in 2014, a group allegedly called Guardians of Peace carried out a sequel injection attack on Sony Pictures. It's definitely hit the news. The fact that it was a sequel injection attack is surprising because that's one of the ones most people know how to take care of. They stole confidential data, including unreleased movies, personal information, and internal emails. So, go forth, do studio. Thank you.